Could I have your attention, please? Could I have your attention, please? We are now going to move to our second panel on reformist movement. Mahnaz Afghami, the founder and president of Women's Learning Partnership for Rights, Development and Peace, and the executive director of the Foundation for Iranian Studies. And as far as I'm concerned, she is the mother of the modern Iranian women's movement in Iran, and I had the privilege to work with her. Mahnaz is going to chair this meeting. We'll follow the pattern of the previous meeting. We'll go our two speakers, Kisha and then Lilia, and then followed by Mahnaz, and then we'll open the floor to questions and comments. Mahnaz, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Haleh. Thank you for this wonderful identification of me as the mommy of the Iranian women's movement. If I'm the mommy, Haleh definitely is the auntie, because we worked together 35 years ago on and ongoing, both for Iranian women and with Iranian women and in the Middle East. It's a pleasure to be here. It was a fascinating panel in the morning, and sorry, I missed some of it, living in Washington, traffic. But it's going to be a great panel, I think ours as well. It's not easy to match that one, but we'll try. We have two of the best people who could, in effect, bring extraordinary light to the interesting issue of reformist women. Their introduction is in your introductory material, so I won't go through it. Kesha Ali will be the first, and she has done some extraordinary work on, especially on sexual ethics and Islam, and with relation to texts, and she's continuing that work, as you will see, in other publications. So, Kesha, maybe go with you first.
Yes, thank you. So I want to begin, of course, by thanking the Wilson Center for this introduction to a fabulous organization and an audience quite different from the ones that I normally get to address as an academic, which tend to be comprised of either other specialists in Islamic studies who work on early fiqh texts in Arabic, or college sophomores. So you're sort of a different kind of a crowd, and I hope that we can have a productive discussion today. I must also thank the organizers of this conference for putting together a bundle of wonderful material about the Wilson Center, which was waiting for me in my hotel room last night, including this pamphlet with a wonderful quote from the man himself, which is going to give me a place from which to begin. He says, "The man who has the time, the discrimination, and the sagacity to collect and comprehend the principal facts, and the man who must act upon them, are engaged in a common enterprise." Now, this was Woodrow Wilson in 1910, so we'll forgive him the masculine-only reference and take it to encompass all of us, although, of course, we must be aware of that active extension. This is particularly apropos because what I want to speak about today is the relationship between reform and reformist thought. And in some ways, it's a pity that I'm following Amina Wadud, because she said much of what I have to say and said it much more eloquently and with wonderful illustrations. But nonetheless, I hope that my remarks will be able to broaden the question a little bit more and perhaps ask a series of questions that might get us into a discussion about possible paths to reform. Now, let me just say another word about who I am and what I do, because that will give you a sense of the limitations of my approach to these kinds of questions. I tend to work on texts and on their interpretation, and I'm often very critical of the ways that modern writers from a whole variety of perspectives, including people we can call neo-traditionalist, including people we can call neoconservative, including people who would claim for themselves the label of traditionalist, and including many people who would call themselves feminist or progressive, even while they're aware of the limitations of these labels. I've been critical of some of the ways in which they have drawn on scriptural texts, and particularly legal texts, which is my own area of specialization. Now, I do recognize that it is much, much easier to critique the ahistorical ways in which modern discourses talk about justice or equality, and to call those superficial or selective and something like that, and much, much harder to build a compelling discourse. And I don't want to minimize the very real and very important work that Muslim feminists and other reformers have done to bring the notion that justice and dignity and equality are basic principles that one has to confront in talking about family law or women in society to the table. This is a major change, right? We should not be misled by the fact that people are appealing to these as timeless Islamic principles into believing that they have always constituted part of the mainstream of Muslim discourse about these topics. They haven't. So this is a major achievement. Nonetheless, as a scholar who works historically and textually and from within a framework of religious studies theory, and as an historian sometimes, I'm very uncomfortable when I'm asked to collaborate with people doing practical kinds of reform work. We're drafting a proposal for a model family law, and can you tell me what you think about this claim to these Islamic rights for women? You know, on the one hand, I really want to see that law in place because it's much better than the law that currently exists. On the other hand, I want to pick apart their logic in claiming that this is the Islamic right for women. So what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit in the way that academics do about a couple of things I've read. And then I'm going to talk about how that interacts with some other ideas, and hopefully we can go from there. I'm going to do some reflection about Muslim reformist thought in general, and then more particularly reflection about Muslim reformist thought by women and that by men, and how the two differ and overlap. And I want to make a plea at the beginning that I'm speaking in generalities in many cases, and there are certainly exceptions to these rules. So I'm going to start by talking about two male reformist thinkers who've published things recently doing an assessment of the state of reformist thinking. One is Nasser Hamid Abu Zaid, who is an Egyptian thinker who has been in exile for a variety of pretty interesting reasons in the Netherlands for a number of years. And the other is Tariq Ramadan, who is from an Egyptian background, but a Swiss thinker who's also currently in Rotterdam, actually in the Netherlands. In many ways, these men come from similar backgrounds. In other ways, they're quite different in terms of their constituencies, in terms of their approaches, in terms of their basic concerns. Nasser Hamid Abu Zaid has a book on reform and change that came out in 2005 or 2006, where he offers an assessment of many new approaches to reading and writing and thinking about Islam, and to promoting programs of reform in specific political contexts. He devotes a chapter to Soroush, and he talks about Fazl Rahman, and he talks about a lot of people. And he has a short chapter wherein he offers an assessment of Muslim feminism. And he offers a pretty dismal assessment of the achievements of Muslim feminism. And it makes sense, given the parameters of his thought, because in his argument, Muslim feminism or Islamic feminism has been very Quran-centric, and very Quran-centric in a pretty narrow kind of way. Now, he has made the claim, and is assessing other people's thought in keeping with his claim, that the crucial move that needs to happen for Muslim reformist thought is to move beyond seeing the Quran as text to seeing the Quran as discourse. So rather than the Quran as a kind of static artifact, the Quran is an act of communication between humanity and God. This was a two-way communication, and in treating the text the way that many contemporary Muslim thinkers do, we run up against inherent limitations. And so because Muslim feminist thinkers have become trapped by this paradigm, they're not able to really go anywhere. There are limits imposed to this methodology, and women run smack up against them. So that's his assessment. Now, Tariq Ramadan has a very new book called Radical Reform, and it's a big book, and I think it offers actually some very, very important fodder for future discussion and some important insights, I think. I'm only going to touch briefly on a few points. One thing that he argues is that it's important to go beyond the focus only on the texts to also take into account the context. And he talks about the two texts, actually, the book and the universe, but he's also talking specifically about people who are scholars of text, the Quran, the Hadith, and fiqh, and then people who are specialists in certain kinds of applied disciplines outside the religious sciences. So sociologists, anthropologists, people who are engaged in work on the environment and so forth. And he calls for bringing these people into a consultation with religious scholars and having an equal dialogue out of which new solutions will grow. And this is the other kind of two-part method that he talks about. He says it's not sufficient for Muslims to simply adapt to their context, that is, come up with a fatwa which allows a formalistic solution to Muslims living in the modern world, but rather to transform the whole way that Muslims are engaging the world in order to enable a kind of transformation, right? So it's not simply that Muslims have to find a way to be Muslim in the world, but Muslims have to change the world, not just to Islamize it, but in order to make it a better place for everyone, Muslim and non-Muslim, to live. Now, one of the things that's most notable about this book is that there is a great deal of attention devoted to women's issues. There's a chapter, but there's also discussion of other kinds of issues involving women in other chapters that aren't specifically devoted to women. And there's a call for women to participate with men in these discourses, not only as specialists outside of the religious disciplines, but also as fuqaha, jurists, and text scholars. However, there is no woman named in the text, apart from 4 women of the Prophet's time, 3 of whom were members of his immediate family and household. So there's a disconnect between, on the one hand, this call for women to participate fully, and I have every reason to believe it's really a sincere call, and on the other hand, this lack of engagement with what women have been producing for many, many years. There is, in fact, a long footnote in the book, the longest by more than double any other footnote, that deals with scholarship produced by Muslim feminists and women reformist thinkers. And this is not sour grapes. My book is in there. And it's sort of this long list. And then it says, and these are of more and less worth. That's a paraphrase, but more or less. There's no real engagement with what's going on. So as far as an assessment of women's thought, does this help us at all? Where does this get us? Now, you will, of course, have spotted, let's call it the irony, not the hypocrisy of what I'm doing, which is using men to talk about women. But I think that this is a way in to a very important topic, because from the perspective of the West, which is, after all, where this conference is being held and where many of us are getting most of our ideas about the discussions that are going on in the Muslim world or among Muslim communities. These are the thinkers about whom we hear, with the exception of Professor Wadud, who is an exception in many, many ways, in that she's taking theological ideas in particular seriously. So why don't we have women as these big thinkers who are prominent in the West? There's Fazlur Rahman, there's Muhammad Abdu, Rashid Ridda, Abdul Karim Surush, Abdullahi Naim, various kinds of people whose books are coming out from major university presses and who get invited in lecture series and who become the voice of a kind of reformist Islam, and whose methodologies are very often adopted and adapted by women thinkers to particular purposes. Fazlur Rahman is de rigueur in any kind of feminist discussion of law, right? I mean, I use him. Everybody does. Why is it him and not somebody else? this leads to the question, I think, of, first of all, is a grand theoretical model a worthwhile endeavor, right? Should feminist thinkers even bother? Is there a need for a woman-centered paradigm shift? I'm going to say that there is, but I think we do need to ask the question, for what? What's the ultimate end goal here, right? If it's not a scholarly monograph or a lecture tour, what's the point? So what are women doing then? Because as we've seen, women are doing a great deal. And women are thinking a great deal. But the kinds of intellectual production that women reformists are doing tends to be specific and grounded and circumscribed, right? Women's issues in particular, women's rights, particular kinds of claims about family law, particular kinds of claims about political rights. Often, but not always, the things that women reformers are engaged in doing are not gender specific, right? They relate to things like clean water, sufficient food, other kinds of government corruption that weigh heaviest on women because of certain kinds of socio-familial organizations, but that aren't specifically gendered in the sense that we talk about gender issues. If women are working on these issues, then how are they interacting with this religious reformist thought? One of the things that we find is, as Abu Zaid points out, this appeal to Quran and Quranic principles and drawing on Quran. Although it doesn't always happen in the field, it does happen very much as a level of justification for engaging in these kinds of projects. We have selective approaches to scripture. We have even more in campaigns for family law and family law reform, appeals to principles and then often selective extraction of rulings from fiqh. That's happening a little bit less, actually, with ground-up initiatives like Musawa and other kinds of programs where there's an attempt to create a new ruling grounded in Islamic principles, but not tinkering at the individual level with fiqh rules. But nonetheless, that's very much a part of some specific kinds of campaigns. Why? Well, one reason, I think, is that women are very often interested in getting things done, right? They want change. In many cases, it's because these are changes that are necessary for them to live lives of dignity and equality and justice. If the family law is unjust with regard to divorce, unjust with regard to support, unjust with regard to custody, then in order to make those changes and have a life that isn't narrowly restricted by what the judge says you can do, you need to make your case in terms that appeal to whoever has the power to change that law, be it the king or the legislature or in some cases the media, which has the power to sway public opinion and so forth. I think also that there's very often a desire, a legitimate desire, to be taken seriously as people who can speak in religiously authoritative ways, because with the current climate of opinion, in many Muslim-majority countries, to speak in an authoritative way about what is good or what is right means to speak about what is Islamic. And if one is to speak about what is Islamic, one can't be at the same time challenging the basic paradigm for how one understands what Islamic is. So again, I think this is a kind of strategic move. So where does this leave women reformist thinkers? Does it simply mean that women continue to struggle for particular kinds of changes using the language of these new paradigms that male reformist scholars are coming up with, or is there something else that can be done? I don't want to valorize the universal and the male and dismiss the particular and the female, but I think that it's very important to ask what's being missed when one draws on theories grounded in male experience or male approaches to texts, and again here I'm aware that I'm generalizing, for endeavors that seek to promote the dignity of women. And so here I think it's possible to think about what would a theory look like founded and rooted in women's experience and insights. And here I'm very glad that Amina Wadud spoke first, because she made an eloquent and persuasive case for why this is necessary, both generally in terms of the Abraham circumcision argument at Eid, right? That male experience is somehow human experience and women's experience isn't, but also with regard to methodologies, to approaching the text from a methodology that is grounded in women's lived experience. Sadia Sheikh, a South African scholar, has done something similar in a discussion about tafsir of praxis, exegesis that grows out of praxis. So here let me come back to Tariq Ramadan again. This notion of not adaptation but transformation is one I think that we can resurrect and promote women's experience as something that can be used to transform the way that reformist thought is done. And though I don't want to prize originality, I do want to point out that this is not an idea that is unique. I mean, first of all, there's nothing new under the sun, but also this has a long pedigree within women's studies and feminist thought in general. I have actually a reference to women's ways of knowing, which is certainly one place that this comes up. But the place that this comes from for an academic like me is in, for instance, the theory of women's history. So theorists about women's history talk about the move from taking the grand narrative of male-based political history and inserting women at various points into the narrative to rethinking the whole notion, for instance, of periodizing based on political regimes, to include women's experience and better account for it. So you don't add women and stir, or add women and jostle lightly to a political history, but rather rewrite and reconceptualize what history might look like once it's fully inclusive of women's experience. And of course the same can be said about social history and racial history and so forth. I think that in Muslim reformist thought, this is the beginning of the process. Certainly, with regard to theology, we have in this room an example of someone who's doing that. With regard to fiqh, there are a number of women, graduate students, beginning the process of not only rethinking fiqh rulings, but also beginning to think about legal theory. And how legal theory and legal methodology is gendered, which is not something that has to date ever really been questioned. Now, this leaves us, of course, with the question of how does reformist thought translate directly into reform? I think that in some ways thinking about a cyclical or bidirectional model instead of a unidirectional model can be helpful. But it is, I want to stress, bound to be really an uneasy process. And the challenge for me personally in thinking about practical implications of my work is thinking about the balance between, on the one hand, producing really critical, significant scholarship that asks really, really hard questions, and on the other hand, being aware that this doesn't have a direct practical implementation. And in many ways, I think feeling free to say that there is no direct practical implication for this, that I have the luxury of doing work that is, at least in the short term, fairly useless to the majority of Muslim women, in some ways frees me to then think different thoughts. And I wouldn't do what I do if I didn't think that ultimately ideas were very, very important. So thank you.
Thank you very much. This was extremely informative, and we'll get back to it after we hear from Lilia. And she also has an extraordinary background, an aspect of which is dealing with health and the issues that we're considering, and can add wonderfully to our conversation. So please, Lilia.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure for me to be in panel with you and speaking after Kesia Ali, thank you very much. I apologize for my English is not perfect, but I will try to do my best. I would like to thank Haleh for giving me this chance to be here with you and for all this discussion. What I will bring here is the case of Tunisia, and I think it will be, I think, okay. Okay.
No, it's open.
Okay. I think the case of Tunisia is a little bit interesting, and we can have reflection on what was said this morning. In order to talk about reformist women, because it's the subject, thinkers in the Arab world, I would like to situate it in the case of Tunisia historically, culturally and politically. And among the women who appeared in sociocultural and political fields in Tunisia between the 1930s and the 1950s, after all the debate which was animated by many reformist thinkers, men, etc., traveling among the Arab world and in Turkey, inspired by Egypt, Turkey, and Europe. And Tunisia was under French rule at this time, and it has a significant impact at different level. Among these women, we can cite some names which are not very well known, and probably because Tunisia is a small country. But we have Bshira bin Mrad. Bshira bin Mrad's case is often cited. She is the daughter of the Sheikh Mohammed Salah bin Mrad, who published a book, The Veil of Mourning, in opposition to Tahar Haddad's groundbreaking work on our women, Islamic legislation and society in 1930, and who was isolated after this and died 5 years later. And who, Mohammed Salah bin Mrad, who also opposed the naturalization of Tunisians as French citizens. And Bshira bin Mrad founded a women's organization which had as its principal aim the education of girls in order to make them better mothers and wives. Among her other actions, she also worked to have Tunisian students in France, who were at that time all men, sponsored by families of the Tunisian bourgeoisie with many daughters, with the aim of strengthening ties and discouraging mixed Tunisian-French marriage. And I cited this because now with the new women thinkers, they will be discussing this question about marriage with not a Muslim man, and that it is not discouraged by how it's discussed in Islam, etc. Other women of this period, we have other women, طبعا سعاد النايفر in Tunis, Manana Riri in Sousse, and Fatouma Namla, Majid Abou Lila in Sfax, etc., who worked to establish school for girls at that time. Naturally, they were discussing many other legal aspects. With independence in the 1950s and the promulgation of the new personal status code, which gave to women many basic rights, such as the abolition of the polygyny, divorce allowed only through judicial procedures and not through repudiation, equal pay for equal work, co-educational schools, etc., a new women's elite began to emerge since the 70s. The impact of this new elite began to be strongly felt across Tunisian society starting in the mid-70s and manifested itself in the wide variety of orientations, from secular to religious, from oppositional to political and independent to supporting the government, from artistic to liberal professions, and so on. And as a result, in the last 2 decades in particular, a growing number of books and other publications are being written by women in both Arabic and French, and their impact in the public sphere continue to grow. You have to know that in the 30s we had only one new journal for women, which called Layla, and it was directed by men, and it was most of the writers were men, etc. Donc we can measure the differences and which was done during this period. After this brief historical background, in the last few years, we see the expression of two main ideological tendencies among these new elite, new women's elite. One group employing a historical and political approach and tending to be expressed by women born around the period of independence, and whom declare themselves as a Muslim woman. And the second being largely apolitical and implicitly pro-establishment, and being expressed by women born in the middle of the 70s and later. In this, the Tunisian case is different from Egypt and from Morocco. In Tunisia, we do not see the public expression of women Islamic thinkers, something that had emerged in Tunisia toward the middle of the 70s until the end of the 80s, and the period of the transition between Bourguiba and Ben Ali, but that did not last much longer than that. Donc we don't have this kind of publications. But after this brief historical background, I would like to focus on two women, one from each of the above groups, to help us to understand the situation of reformist thinking among contemporary women in Tunisia. In doing this, I will try to explore four questions: how we define these women, what are their concerns, how do these appear on the national level and at the broader regional and global. The two women I have chosen, and they are really good examples, they represent very well the major groups. The two women are Jalila Bakkar and Olfa Yousef. I will look to what they wanted to change, what makes their approaches new and innovative, and how they situated themselves in relation to the power in place locally and at the global level. Jalila Bakkar is born in the 50s, and having studied French literature, is a theater, television, and a film actor who founded a number of theater groups since the early 70s. She is also an author of a number of theoretical works and collaborates with her husband, who often directs her plays. What makes her especially significant is that her theoretical work have broad appeal, usually lasting for many months in the theaters, although occasionally subjected to censorship. And what makes her a reformist are the themes of her work, particularly a case in which are political in the philosophical sense of the term, as role of the Arab intellectual. We don't discuss anymore as in the 30s. Role of the Arab intellectual, relationship to Islam, citizenships, and power. She will use frequently particular cases in order to make more generally political arguments, and in her work, women are not taken in isolation or objectified, but are seen as historical and political actors. Olfa Yousef, a member of the younger generation, born in the 70s, and a university professor of Arabic literature and a linguist, made her earlier mark in her doctoral dissertation, which offers a reading of the Quran that stresses its polysemy, a theme that she has continued to pursue in her subsequent work. She also has appeared frequently on television, leading discussion on contemporary Arabic literature. Her main subjects are women, sexuality, marriage and divorce, gender role within the family, inheritance, and the right of all individuals, including, of course, women to marry a non-Muslim man, to exercise ijtihad. Her book after her thesis, including her most recent Bewilderment of a Muslim Woman, have been published in Tunisia in Arabic and have occasioned a great discussion and controversy in the Tunisian media, where she often finds herself criticized by feminists and intellectuals. On the other hand, she appears to be very welcome in official circles. In 2006, she was chosen to provide the official commemoration speech to celebrate the personal status code, and during Ramadan 2008, on the new private television, she at times gave the official religious speech leading to the breaking of the fast. Even on this occasion, she is not wearing the hijab, and many of her references were to psychoanalysis and Lacan, etc. In 2007, she accomplished the Hajj, and in the same year, she published in France a book which is the title Le Coran au risque de la psychanalyse, basing her title on the French psychoanalyst Françoise Dolto, very well known, who wrote Les Évangiles au risque de la psychanalyse. It's the same title. With regard to the women's discourse on the earlier period, the 1930s and the 50s, these two reformist women employ two forms of discourse that were not available to women at that time. On the one hand, theoretical creation and performance, and the other, psychoanalysis. For Jalila Bakkar, the struggle is for memory, the republic, democracy and human rights, critical social discourse, aesthetics and expression through languages, etc. For Olfa Yousef, the struggle is for opening ijtihad to women, criticizing the established ulama all over the world, and the so-called new preachers, such as Amru Khalid, and opening Quranic interpretation to multidisciplinary approach, and most particularly to psychoanalysis. If for Jalila Bakkar the cause of the Arab intellectual, Palestine, the failure of the left in the Arab world, the events of the 11th September are at the center of her thinking, Olfa Yousef represent a modern Islam that is promoted by the centralized state, an Islam meant to be tolerant, protective of women's rights, non-violent, supportive of the powers in place. What Jalila Bakkar proposed is something akin to a Sufi Islam, an individual and private Islam, and aesthetics as languages, and social justice as foundation of the political order. For her, these elements are universal. Olfa Yousef, who also has an universalist vision, criticized the limits of interpretation imposed by the male religious establishment, who have interpreted Islam in ways that emphasize the inequality between men and women, extending an approach articulated by Arab and Muslim feminists since the 1980s, among whom we find in the Maghreb Fatima Bennisi and so on. Whereas Olfa Yousef's vision may be limited by virtue of her relationship to power, it is also more of a populist vision, but devoid of context and not treating in depth the significant contribution of recent Arab intellectuals, including those of women, which and on the other hand, while Jalila Bakkar's vision may be seen as more explicitly political, it is also arguable that it is at the same time somewhat elitist. As for their global reach, Jalila Bakkar is an envoy at a world-class level, bringing to a wide variety of countries in Europe a progressive example of Tunisian women and artistic expression, following in the outward-looking policies of the independence struggle and the regime of Bourguiba, even when she is criticizing him. Ulfa Yousef, participating as she does in today's structure of power in Tunisia, also shares in official Tunisian effort to have a global reach, presenting to the world an image of a tolerant, peaceful, moderate Islam, something she expresses in her book Le Coran au risque de la psychanalyse, recently published in French and in Paris. And in this way, directed more to the European public than to a Tunisian one. Both find themselves in dialogue with Europe, as it is the Tunisian economic and political system, even when the official Tunisian position makes overture to Africa and the broader Arab and Muslim world. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank both panelists for their insightful presentations. Kashia's review of the literature of textual analysis and reinterpretation, I think, was a very helpful framework, and Lilia's explanation of how reformist women in Tunisia have acted in order to bring about change, in effect, complements that presentation. I personally would like to, before we engage in dialogue with our speakers, I would like to take both of these aspects of the conversation to the actualities of women's activism to bring about reform. And I specifically would like to point to the work of the partners of my organization, Women's Learning Partnership, which works in 20 countries in 4 regions, especially Muslim majority countries, and more specifically focus on the work of our Moroccan partners, who in effect worked with Tunisia and Algeria to bring about family law reform. What is interesting in the work that has been done that has led to that particular and very interesting reform is the realization that a number of common sort of agreements have to come about among women themselves before mobilization can take place. And that requires studying the situation as is and also bringing about some kind of a shared vision as to where we want to go. In terms of the situation as is, we are faced with societies that have changed considerably in terms of interrelationship of the genders and in terms of every aspect of interrelationship of people in communities. We have circumstances in many of the Muslim majority countries where women outnumber men in universities, and more they are in specialized technical fields that were once the domain of men. We also have many families headed by women and supported by women, and we have women in professions working in larger and larger numbers. And we have an understanding as a whole by the people in these countries that they aspire to human rights and democracy. The many surveys that have been taken, the World Values Survey being one of them, has shown that in some of the Muslim majority countries, the percentage of people that seek or consider democracy an ideal way of life is higher than most actual democracies in other parts of the world. And so that aspiration is there. However, unfortunately, the other aspect of it is that when you get to ideas that are liberal ideas, such as gender relations, such as tolerance of the religious diversity, tolerance of different sexual lifestyles, there is a definite plunge in how they approach that. So this is another dilemma within which people work. But the other realization that has helped us a great deal, helped the activist groups a great deal, is that people are very much connected to people elsewhere. This is a side effect of the positive side effect of globalization, one might say, except when we come to think of the swine flu. But in other terms, it's a very positive thing that people travel a lot, they connect a lot, they're working with the internet and social networking and so forth. So they do want the fruits of development. They want sustainable development. They want all that science and change and progress can bring to them. So all of this is there. So we don't see in these countries really any even enclaves, I would say, that are strictly traditional. There is a mixture of modernity and traditionalism throughout these societies. It's not as if these sections are separate, or that within the same groups that you have separate enclaves. No one, even the most conservative ayatollahs in Iran, live a conservative traditional life. They're all on the web. They all have their own websites. They all are twittering, not twittering, at least communicating with others. So this is the condition that lives are not led the way they were supposed to have been led at some time in the past. So given these circumstances, what are women doing? They're thinking that, for one thing, focusing more than before, and focusing more than the Western feminists possibly have done in the past, on practical ways of changing things. How does change come about? So there's not a very strict ideological line separating feminists who live in Muslim societies from others, men, policymakers, other women, and so forth. Religious, non-religious. They want to come together to create ways to bring about change. Now, in order to do that, there is a focus on a holistic approach to women's condition and to the condition of society. Kasia mentioned that women interpreters ought to focus, or not ought to, but don't usually focus on the holistic approach. They go to specific women-centered sections of texts and concentrate on that. But the idea here is that women and men have a life that has many aspects. There are aspirations for rights, for democracy, their need for development, sociological impact of various items of law on their lives and so forth, as well as culture and religion. And this, I think, is a very new thing to feminism, even to Western feminism, totally new to Western feminism, and somewhat new in a systematic way to the activists in Muslim-majority countries. So religion and culture are an important part of this holistic approach to how to bring about change. So one aspect of it is declarations and international covenants and conventions. One aspect of the things that they need to consider is the real lived life of people, what problems actually they're facing, what problems the way they're facing things brings to the whole society, and so forth. The other is the constitutions and the legal setup that already exists, which for the most part has really very little to do with religion. Only when it comes to family law, one could say, and to penal code in some cases, is religion a very important part of lawmaking. So that has to be brought to mind as well. That is the conflict between a constitution such as the Moroccan or some of the others, which says straightforward that even the Iranian constitution at some point, that men and women are equal before God and before the law. So there is the conflict between that and the various other laws and the actual situation of women in the family, which is the most important place where reform needs to be made. So that, and then the social scientific, that is, what does, for instance, the minimum age of marriage do in terms of population? What impact does it have on health of women? What impact does it have on the economy of a country? So these multifaceted aspects of a holistic approach to human life is very important. So it requires a vision that takes all these things into consideration. And what is new in this movement, one could say, is this holistic approach. In the past, religion and culture were not as integrated in the process as they are today. But one has to also realize that it's not limited to religion and culture, that reform requires a whole lot, a piece, an important and vital piece of which is religion and culture. And these have to be integrated and interact with each other. They can't be seen in isolation. So that's one aspect. And the other is that, again, that is new to us, and it's less prevalent in the West, although in the West, the feminist movement began with people like John Stuart Mill, for instance, writing about the condition of women. But in effect, men have had very little to do with women activists. In the Muslim majority world, men are an integral part of this process, and so are children. They've always been at the center. So families have been at the center. It's been understood that a woman cannot have this fulfilled life without some integration of these various aspects of her life. So that's an aspect that's very important, that women approach men both as grassroots activists. In Iran, for instance, it's an extraordinary situation where young men are participating in the 1 million signatures campaign at such a rate they're getting arrested. The people who arrest them actually spit on them. What are you guys doing in the women's movement? You know, I mean, what's wrong with you? But they are doing it. They're doing it in large numbers as activists, as thinkers, and as policymakers. So inclusion of men and bringing the idea that we're not us against them, women against men. We want to make women rule the world. We want to work together to make a better world. And the other aspect of it is what Amina mentioned this morning about her own approach, and that is that the focus is on agency. That is, the Moroccans have produced this book, which I have here. We've translated it into English for communication with other countries. It was originally in Arabic. This describes the Moroccan experience. Now, the important focus of this is agency. That is, they use all this knowledge and information about laws, about international declarations, about human rights principles, as well as interpretations of various texts and holy texts and sayings, the hadith. And so a woman will choose. She's not told this is right, that is wrong, you must do this, you must do this. They say a woman can choose. And especially in Islam, which has as a foundational principle adapting to the times, and where in principle there is no formal church. There's no formality between a person and God. If you get advice and fatwas, it's because you choose to do that. You choose who your leader will be. So it's not that you must have this framework within which to practice. So it leaves a lot of leeway for interpretation. And so the other final principle that is part of this whole effort is that the emphasis is on universal human rights. Universal human rights have gotten a bad rap in parts of the world because they are seen as if they're Western. They're not Western, Eastern, or anything else. They're things that human beings seek and aspire to. A lot of people from around the world have gotten together and worked very hard to put these aspirations on paper, and every government in the world has signed on to it. There is nothing Western about them. They're in experience of everybody throughout the world. However, things have to be adapted to, put in cultural context, put in religious context, put in the feasibility context of where you are on a matrix of economic and political development. So prioritizing, how do you communicate these rights? How do you raise people's consciousness, and how do you mobilize them? These have to be implemented on a culturally specific basis. So universal rights agency importance of all these elements, knowledge building and mobilization of the public in order to support change. Because initially when the Moroccan family code was going to be changed, there was a lot of backlash, and the backlash was not only by fundamentalists, it was by ordinary grassroots women wearing jeans and no headscarf were against it, because it was posited as anti-religious. So now, of course, this has been done, that grassroots mobilization and awareness building and knowledge sharing is very important. Now, just say one quick thing and end. The other aspect of this process in Morocco, which is a model for other Muslim majority countries, and again, it's the Maghreb, it's not just Morocco, but the important aspect of it is the way it travels, and that's what we're talking about when we're talking about this century and this way of working. The law was passed in 2004. The book was translated in 2005. We took it to Thailand, where we had all of our partners from around the Muslim world. We also had 10 heads of Iranian NGOs coming to Thailand. Auspiciously, nobody got in trouble. They came as tourists to Thailand, but we had 10 days of training there and communication with the Moroccans. Our board member, Zaina Anwar, was there, and subsequently we also asked Zaina and Rabia Nasiri of Morocco to present it here at Johns Hopkins. The book was translated into Persian, put on the web. The Persians took it to Iran. It helped the 1 million signatures campaign. Zaina took it to Malaysia, and it built into the Mosawa, which I think, although I missed it, but I think probably Margot has referred to it, and Amina, a terrific, and Isabel, a lot of people here were there, a terrific gathering of 250 members from all over the Muslim world, building solidarity to work along these lines that I've been explaining to you and is reflected in the Moroccan experience for change in the family laws. So something is happening, and what is happening is a really good thing. Unfortunately, it doesn't get the press and the media that it should get, because we're too busy blowing each other up and too busy concentrating on cases of being blown up. The real work of grassroots mobilization, the real work of democracy building, the real work of looking at human rights in ways that are important, applicable, and people can be receptive to from variety of cultures and can have a role in building, is being done by women who are reforming not just the approach to religion, but with a great help from interpreters such as Amina and Kashia and others. The use of that has helped a great deal to shape this holistic approach in a way that is going to be changing these societies. And the next generation, who is in fact Twittering and is on Facebook and is connected and is blogging and is talking to other people, is going to be using these examples and working with them. And I may add also that in this century that we are in, movements are not going to be what they were before. We're not going to have demonstrations. We're not going, maybe some, but not basically, that's not how it's going to be. We're not going to have mass statements. We're not going to have special faces of the leadership. The movement is going to be in small places, as Eleanor Roosevelt said. It's going to be in small communities, people focusing on something that touches their lives and uniting in order to push for it. And people are going to be, and they are, at least the women activists are, much more tolerant of working together, both with men and with other people with different ideas, in order to have a win-win situation for change. I hope I don't sound too Pollyanna, but what I've seen really impresses me, that this is happening, and it is real, and it will change the face of our world. Thank you.
Questions.
Please go ahead.
Just wait for the manager. Waiting for the
Okay. We will take the mic to each speaker, and could you please say your name and which organization you're connected to?
Hello, I'm Jocelyn Cesari. I'm connected to Harvard University. My question is to Lilia Lavidi about the young scholar who you presented as a figure of modern Islam. I was quite interested and intrigued by the fact that she's also patronized and protected by the state, because in other Arab countries she would be seen as a threat to the state interest. So this was quite interesting to me. And so this brings me to my question, which is, what is the following or reception of someone like her, not only in Tunisia, but in other parts of the Muslim world? Is she known? Is she read? And how is she perceived vis-à-vis this global, transnational Islamic or reformist movement that Manaz was talking about?
The case of Olfa Yusuf is really very interesting because Tunisian case, I probably didn't discuss a little bit about because I had only 10 minutes, donc I had to, but I have to say that women were always very important in influencing the reforms in Tunisia. In the 1950s, when we adopted the new code, it was the result of the all-women movements. This has to be known, and it's not enough known in the West, unfortunately, and in many Muslim countries too. Second thing is when we had the change in 1987 between Bourguiba and Ben Ali, the feminists were very strong on the politics that was adopted after 87. And we can see it that all the debate that was happening in the 80s was in the reform that were adopted in at the end of the 80s and in the 90s. This is something that it is not very well known and which is really very important. With the remark that even when the state adopts the discourse of the feminists, it will not take them as a part of the actor in the government. This is a parenthesis. He will take the discourse, the critiques, etc., and he will adopt a new law, but not taking the act. But this is one thing. The case of Olfa Yusuf is really very interesting because she is she is produced by the discourse. She is the product of the discourse of this new republic, and she is much more influenced by the Second Republic than the first, even if she is nurtured with the esprit of Tahar Haddad and the struggle, and the fact that she said in her books that she was very proud that in Tunisia men didn't have the right to marry to more than one woman. She was an adolescent at that time, and she was impressed, and it's why she decided that later she wrote her thesis and all her books, and why she was interested by this kind of interpretation, how in Tunisia men were not allowed to marry to more than one woman, when in the other part of the world men could do it. Donc, and in the same time, she is protected by the state because she had now she is in a position at the head of center of institutions, but she I think she decided to write her book in French and to publish it in French because she wanted to have more space, more wider audience but we don't know until now, because it's recently, it was done only 1 year ago, how it will have, what kind of impact it will have. I would like to add, if it is possible, I would like to say that in her references, we can see that many authors, like Amina, Wadud, etc., Badran, etc., are cited by her. But how she is discussing them, etc., it's not yet, we can see very well. And I would like to say another thing, because it's really very important. In Europe, the feminist movement in Europe didn't look at all at the situation of Muslim women who were there since the end of the 60s, and all the trouble that Europe are having now. We can say that feminist women didn't contribute at all to resolve or to listen, to hear, or these kind of problems. Thank you.
All right, let's see. Over there, please.
May I?
Yes, the mic. Oh,
I'm sorry.
all right, go ahead, then we'll do the next.
My name is Mervat Hatem, and I'm at Howard University. I had two questions, one to Keshia and then one to Lilia. Thank you very much for the references to Nasra Hamid, Abu Zaid, as well as Tariq Ramadan. And I'm kind of wondering if the way they present the contributions of women to the reform agenda, especially religiously inspired religious agenda or Muslim agenda, is really a reflection of the fact that their knowledge, their very limited knowledge of the work that has been done by women, not just in religious studies, but Muslim women since the middle of the 19th century, because they've been engaged very much in the discussion of the reform agendas. And of course, the religious sort of the reinterpretation of Islam is the last frontier for women. I mean, you know, they've been elected to parliament, they're university professors, they are engaged in public work, and therefore, I mean, it's not exactly that they've been isolated in their societies, but the religious arena is the last frontier. And in the last frontier, we're only seeing one generation, the work of one generation, and therefore it is understandable that there will be other generations that sort of not focus simply on women's agendas. I mean, I like your response to that. And then with Lilia, the problem I think that most students of gender in the Middle East have with Tunisian women is the role the state has co-opted, basically, their discourses. And therefore, when one reads their work, it is very difficult to try and figure out what is their own independent opinion, given the fact that the state is such a huge and overwhelming presence and basically controls very much what it is that they're able to say and what kinds of perspectives that they are able to put forward. And if you could relate that, this very restricted, this very restricted space that women in Tunisia have politically to be able to express their independent views on the women that you've just shared a discussion with us. Thank you.
Sure. So first of all, I think you're absolutely right that in many ways this is very, very new, right? I mean, women's engagement in specifically religious dialogue, religious interpretation is far more recent than women's involvement in other kinds of social reform projects. So in that sense, I certainly expect more engagement from the next generation of male reformist thinkers. On the other hand, you know, I don't want to let either of those gentlemen off the hook. I mean, I've been in the last 3 years at least one conference with each of them where women's agendas were very much part of the discussion, and where women were very vigorously debating many of the kinds of concerns we have here, including women who were let's borrow a business metaphor, pushing the envelope, right, on some of these kinds of topics. Now, books have a long gestation period. These things perhaps didn't make it in, but I think there's also something else going on. I think there's a way in which the privileging of the grand narrative and a kind of disconnected universal grand narrative leads to overlooking these kinds of contributions, which even if they eventually end up making universalistic claims, are grounded in particulars and in specifics. And so I think we need to continuously be thinking about that and be engaging that.
It's really very good questions, and it will help me to explain better the situation. In the 70s, we had the emergence of the Islamist movement in Tunisia, and it was probably a part of it was a need for spirituality, religion, cultural background, etc., which was seen a little bit as something that Bourguiba pushed too far. And we had at the end of the 80s, the beginning of the 90s, with the change with Ben Ali, we thought that, when we had the change in 1987, all women, part of the government, independent women, feminists, etc., all we were afraid about losing our rights with the CSP. And it was really a bad moment for us for many months until the declaration came and they said, okay, we keep the personal status code. Then we had a political environment which was not helping us at all. We had the civil war in Algeria. We have had the war in Iraq, and we have the political of securities of states, etc. They didn't help us at all, because at any time where we wanted to say anything, to ask for something, to present another way to think, etc., we were said, do you want to have the same situation as in Algeria? And naturally we will say no. Who wants to have the civil war in Tunisia, etc. Donc I think the situation of what happened to women, and it's probably why feminist women took a step back, because they felt that if they are nurturing the state, donc, and Ulfa Yusuf does not have a large marge. She is really working on the eggs. It's really very, very hard to keep an independent discourse, to think, not even to speak, to think independently, and to have a real life as an intellectual. She is really, I didn't bring the articles, she is really very attacked by the newspaper. You don't know how much it is difficult. Donc it's how we can be, and until when the state can protect her if it is protecting her, we don't know.
Thank you. Yes.
Quick question for Kesia. In interpreting the Quran and other texts, I understand that there's been a lot of pushback on using historical critical techniques that would lead to the sort of modernisms that that people have seen in Christianity, and it's been really resisted. And as this second person that you were talking about wanted to take into account context, particularly historical context, how are they dealing with that?
Can you just tell me who you are? I mean, not that it matters to the answer of the question, but just so we know.
My name is Colette Chabot. I'm from George Washington University.
Welcome. Thank you. First of all, I think we need to make a distinction between historical critical textual studies like 19th century biblical studies and then taking historical context into account when interpreting the Quran. And actually, this is something Tariq Ramadan talks about in this book, but it's something that feminists have been doing for a very long time, using that term, of course, very broadly. But they're not the only ones. This has been part of Muslim interpretation of the Quran from very, very early on. In fact, one of the main things that takes up a good deal of the bulk of many, many works of exegesis is an account of the occasions of revelation of particular verses. So situating these verses in very concrete historical locations. Why do you bother to do that? Well, you bother to do that because how you understand this verse depends on its context. So in that sense, I don't think that that part of the process is really being questioned a great deal. Now, questions about the historicity of the Quranic text are, of course, live button issues. And that's not really something that very many people are engaging in. But I also don't think that's where people are going to get the most mileage in terms of textual strategies.
My name is Mirahan Farag. I'm from Egypt and a fellow of Maxwell School at Syracuse University. My question is, I've got the impression that back to Amin's question about this one-way method or way of interpreting from God to man to women, I don't think that this is the prevailing idea, because as he said, that we always see in Quran God, man, and woman together on the same foot. So, and as I'm getting this impression that this is the prevailing understanding maybe of Quran in the West, I'm not sure about that, but it's not the case inside Muslim society. The other thing is that I'm not sure how Nasr Hamid Abu Zaid would explain a practical way of dealing with Quran, not as a text, but as an open conversation, because to my mind, it is already this way. So I'm not sure how he makes this differentiation. And the last word I'm going to say, that the very early explanations and ijtihad about Quran and interpretation of Quran by the four Imams, Abu Hanifa, bin Malik, Shafi'i, and bin Hanbal, I think they were very open-minded to all those kinds of questions we raise nowadays in the 21st century, and there was a lot of discussion of all what we discuss now. But for some reason, I don't know what it is, but maybe a political reason to keep everybody impressed, those discussions are not prevailing anymore. But they are there for anyone who wants to go back to understand more about the open-minded discussions in Islam and in interpreting the text, and how the engaging with text is a kind of conversation, not a kind of one-way interpretation. Thank you.
Okay, so as far as Nasr Hamid Abu Zaid goes, I think we have to let him handle that one on his own. He's written about this a great deal. As far as the question about prevailing mode of interpretation, I think we'll go back to Amina's comment earlier about the fact that the discourse that is commonly shared in Muslim societies today is a very recent discourse. And, furthermore, this sort of unidirectional model, we can't speak to what ordinary Muslims believed in the past because they didn't leave us books. We have to look at what the scholars were writing. And certainly there were scholars who, under many circumstances, talked about women's direct relationship to God. In the fiqh texts about marriage, we hear over and over again, there is no disobedience to God, such that if the husband orders her to do something that disobeys God, she must disobey the husband. On the other hand, in everything that doesn't constitute disobedience to God, they say she has to obey him. So, we can choose to focus on one area or the other, but I don't think that's going to get us all that far today. As far as, the notion of God having a relationship equally with male and female, and that being the common understanding of things, I think that's terrific. As far as your other question, you mentioned the four imams. Of course, this is exactly where my research on fiqh focuses. And so I think it is very important to recognize that many of them felt free. And they're, by the way, they're dealing with fiqh. They're not primarily focused on interpreting Quran, right? I mean, their works are not works of tafsir. They're works of fiqh. And so they certainly felt free to take things in new directions, to be creative, but they were creative very much as part of a larger conversation. These were not four isolated individuals who, had these brainstorms and then originated these schools of fiqh. They are the people onto whom we have projected the foundation of legal schools. They serve as eponyms. They didn't serve as founders. And they were individual representatives of a much, much larger conversation. A very interesting conversation, a conversation that branched out in many, many different directions, some of which didn't survive to flower today, right, the literalists and so forth. On the other hand, they were men in particular kinds of circumstances who took particular kinds of things for granted. Shafi'i and Ibn Hanbal both had walads. They were men who, these are concubines who had borne them children. They were men of their times and places. And so even though they had a certain set of things that they were willing to question, I don't think we want to lionize them as these individual thinkers who broke free of the restraints of their societies and sort of did all of these things. They were creative men in a really interesting and fast-moving, for the 9th century time, and they did important things. And I think if we think about what we can take from that today, if your point is that we need to have ongoing acts of creative interpretation, sure. Right?
Okay, I just wanted to add a question here, and that is, how much are we paying attention to the hadith, which in essence is a much larger problem than the Quran itself, for the sheer numbers of them, and also of the difficulty with authenticity, and the fact that many of the ones that are difficult to authenticate, as well as some that have been, are so detrimental to equality for women. So that's something to have in mind as we go along. Yes, you had a question?
Thank you. Yes, thank you so much. I'm Charlie Ponticelli, and I've worked very closely with my dear friend Haleh over the past 8 years on international women's issues, and with many other representatives of some great organizations here in the room. And I really applaud the discussion today, and particularly Maknaj, your fantastic summing up, because I think it takes us, and maybe this is the subject for a whole nother day's discussion, but moving beyond text and discourse to the agency or to the action. You made the very good point. The movement will be in small places, and it must be. And we have seen this tremendous ripple effect despite the ongoing challenges. So I'm wondering for the panel what your thoughts might be, and also consistent with Haleh's great message at the beginning, that we really need to continue to build the consistency and the continuity of the discussion. So what your thoughts might be, taking it beyond text and discourse to action, the practical steps, and also going to something that one of this morning's speakers talked about, that the international alliances and partnerships, so that we can help those who are working in these small places to effect change. And also, just to throw out, I think women entrepreneurs are doing an incredible job also helping to change the political discourse. And I wondered what your thinking was. We mentioned a little about women in other sectors, but how women are helping to change attitudes, particularly in the economic sphere of activity. Thank you.
Actually, I might attempt this, since this is the essence of the work that we do, is how can you build solidarity, and how can you build solidarity not only among Muslim women, but among the vast majority of women from other faiths who are facing really very similar situations, both in reinterpretation of religious texts and also the effect that it has on them specifically within the family. I think mostly the Jewish women have very similar experiences. So that and people who don't particularly address any religion, people who are without, let's say, adherence to any religion. We really have to broaden the tent and get as many people as possible. Now, again, the internet is helping a great deal. And the other thing that's helping very much is that the human rights field in itself is moving from the area of addressing specific individual abuses somewhere and holding specific governments responsible to address the case of abuse. They're going into campaigns of advocacy and knowledge building research that people can work on together. And these are the cases that we work with. For instance, is a movement for nationality for women, to be able, for women in the Arab world especially, to be able to pass their nationality on to their children and to their husbands. And one thing about this particular advocacy movement is that since their nationality is a very modern thing, there is no particular hadith or any text that we have to deal with. So it is, in a way, one would say, liberating, because you could start on the idea of woman as citizen, which can encompass a whole lot of issues in relation to society without having to deal with interpretation specifically. And the way that it happens is that research, fact-finding, impact of the particular situation is done locally by indigenous women. Then regional alliances are developed, mostly through the internet and meetings, and then, of course, the international support, so that people cannot say that this is cooked up in Europe or the United States. It's really cooked up locally and very well heated, and then it gets to regional and international support. And I think that the use of the internet for building solidarity and sustaining interest is a very important aspect of this, and that's why we have to actually build capability for use of communications technology, because lots of people just simply don't have electricity. We have to have generators, we have to have training and hardware and so forth, but it's an extraordinarily important way of building movements for change, focusing on specific thematic areas: family law, citizenship, adherence to CEDAW without reservations, which is extremely important. We can talk about that later, but I just wanted to respond to Charlie. Did you want to address that? Haleh, it's time for you.
Question and comment and question. When I was in jail, one of the women guards was a woman who had finished the Hausa studies and reached the second level, you know, what we call in Farsi dars kharij. So she was one step from being away mujtahid. It was very interesting. They were my companion for 105 days, and there was a copy of the Quran in the cell, and it was a very good translation in Farsi. So I started reading it, and when she noticed I was reading it, then she came and asked, which surah are you reading? And then we started talking. And I was surprised by the wide interpretation she was given to the Quran, to the text. And I asked her whether this is quite common. Is this what they are taught? And she said, no, this is my own conclusion, and I'm here to enlighten you that you probably have a narrow interpretation of the surah. I said, well, I'm not so sure, but when I mentioned to her that, Amina, you had led a Friday prayer, she was taken by surprise. I mean, this was something she had not thought about, that there is such a possibility. And she said, I need to think about it, and I need to talk. And I said, talk to whom? I said, my teachers, to see whether, how do we go about this, whether this is a possibility or not. So there is a change taking place, and but I'm not sure whether this change will not lead yet again to a narrow interpretation of the text. And if you look at the example of what's happening in Iraq today among women, the interaction I've had in the past with them, they all express their concern and their worries. It's not only the hijab, but it's the narrow interpretation of the existing family law. This is one of the problems. If you look at the recent demonstration in Afghanistan, women had to come out because although the decision was just for the Shiite, but still it was a big problem. They came out and demonstrated, against it, and then the president had to say, well, I didn't read the I will look at it again. I just signed it. So I get a sense that we should be very happy for what is happening, but we should not kid ourselves, because there are a lot of limitations in a lot of these societies we are dealing with. I think we have to find a way to both publicize the positive and also the existing restrictions. For example, when it comes to the question of hijab, it's very exciting to see these colors and the way young girls wear it. My problem is that I think we don't have a choice. In a place like Iran, I'm perfectly happy to see three-quarter or the majority covering themselves. But if I want to go out without the hijab, I'll be punished, I'll be flogged. So the problem is the choice. And that what do we do to guarantee the choice and then let women decide what they want to do? I think this is one of the main issues. And I'm sure Anne will talk about it this afternoon, but when it comes to rights. But Charlie, as you said, the women entrepreneurs, Lilia and I were at a meeting in Amman that we had organized. We brought together a group of women entrepreneurs with a group of women's rights activists. They had never met together. They had never talked together. The women entrepreneurs even were not, Zainab was there too, the women entrepreneurs were not even aware of how necessary it is to have a change in family law so that in order for them to succeed, they took it for granted and they had never mixed. So I think I get a sense we are working all in parallel directions rather than at some stage coming together. And what do we do to get together? I don't know if they care, Lilia, Kisha, Mahnaz, anybody.
Well, actually, this question of backlash or slipping back or seeing the problems is very important. Just a quick thing that I wanted to share with you. We're going to Amman for a big partners meeting, and every week I speak with Asma Khadar, who's a former minister and head of the Jordanian Women's Commission, and she was telling me that since they have started, along with Morocco and some of the others, to talk about CEDAW, Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and removing reservations on CEDAW, and since the King of Morocco has supported that publicly. And, the CEDAW declaration specifically would address the family law issues very much. She said that there have been a coalition, a very almost formal networking of fundamentalists and conservatives in order to beat down the idea of CEDAW. The same usual stuff that if CEDAW comes about, women are going to be all lesbians, they're going to live together, and all kinds of stuff like that. And what is interesting is that apparently the thing that has gone out is speak about this everywhere. She said even at a funeral that she had attended, a private funeral, the mullah, instead of doing the usual funeral stuff, has started talking about CEDAW. So it's that kind of organization, and they have a network. They appeal to people. They use religion. So the counter work that is being done, again, as Haleh mentioned, connecting across areas of interest is also very important, to get different groups with different interests, environmental interests, entrepreneurial interests, and so forth, to build a similar kind of cohesive network and to be able to withstand. And as people who have experienced backlash firsthand, I think it's something to be aware of all the time. I don't know if either of you want to address this, or there's some questions still, but would you rather go on? Could I see hands?
In the back.
Oh my, there's a lot. So do we?
2 questions.
2 questions? Okay. I know this lady has been waiting for a long time. And then one more.
Florida Safiri, former academic, a news editor for a bilingual website based in Washington called Washington TV. Thank you so much for all the presentations this morning. And I'd like to say that a lot of my concerns were raised by both Haleh just now and Mrs. Aframi also brought it out. I'd just like to ask the panelists this morning whether in your experience, the people you've worked with, the conferences you've attended, the countries you've visited, the voice of these women activists and the discourse going on, to what extent is it seeping through, as our friend here mentioned, to women who are professional working, specifically in the legal field, women lawyers, and then teachers, and then does this discourse, is it transcending class background? What is, for instance, in Tunisia, you mentioned, as I find it very interesting, that in the 30s and then in the 30s people have gone back to being pro-Islam a bit, and the modernists are more active and secular. What were the influences on the women of the 30s espousing feminism, and what were the influences on the women now? What is their social background? And you talk about elitism, and I don't know whether you mean a social, economic elite, which is taking on all these activities, or whether you mean cultural, educated elite coming from all sorts of background.
Thank you. Let's get the other question too, and then maybe everybody will answer. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Gilna Rybet. I'm originally from the University of Kent at Canterbury, and I'm here as a Wilson Scholar with the Southeast Europe program. I'm originally from Turkey, so I'm very interested in the discussions this morning, because I don't normally work on this issue, but it was fascinating for me to see that there's so many women reform thinkers in all these countries around Turkey, and no one ever mentioned Turkey. And I know precisely why, because at the moment in my country of origin, there's a very polarized debate about Islam. On the one hand, you have the extreme secularists who feel very threatened by any sort of notions of any Islamic identity coming back. And then on the other hand, you have those who want to portray an Islamic identity. And so women's issues really in Turkey, they're discussed in 2 separate ways. The Kemalists or the secularists think that anything to do with the women's rights has to be completely divorced from Islam. It has to be Western looking and based in the secular Ataturk's principles of the state. Those who wear the headscarf, on the other hand, see women's rights only in the context of the right to wear headscarves in the universities. So there is no sort of overall discussion within the country that brings the two sides together, let alone people interacting with this wider holistic approach that I'm hearing today and all these wonderful grassroots activities going on. And it's not that there aren't issues with women's rights in Turkey. Of course there are. There's still domestic violence. There's honor killings in the southeast. And even in the more Western-oriented secular parts of the country, women, for example, who do have families and careers do not get any support in terms of childcare or anything else in the workplace, so they take a back step in their careers. So none of these issues are being addressed, and I'm wondering, how do we bring Turkey into this? And just one more thing, just to show how polarized the country is, I was very interested to hear the Tunisian example and how the government supports this. Recently I was nominated as one of the 20 most influential Muslim women in Britain by the Times and the British government. And of course, being the only Turkish-origined woman on the list, I got a lot of congratulations from Turkey. And those from the secular establishment, some of them were saying, well, this is wonderful, you know, that a Turk is on the list and we've known you for years, but what is this Muslim identification? Don't you think it's a bit weird? And I felt like I was coming out of the closet by admitting that I was a Muslim to my more secular, staunchly secularist colleagues. And on the other hand, those who were wearing the headscarf were more sort of reserved and saying, oh, that's delightful. We didn't know you considered yourself to be a Muslim. So when you have this kind of polarization, I'm wondering, how does how do you bring Turkey into this discourse? It's very interesting. Thank you.
Who wants to go first? The second question?
Yeah, that's it. The second question.
Oh, this is the question.
You took two questions.
Yeah.
Thank you for the questions. The case of Turkey is very good because probably I didn't mention, but it is really in the center of their head. I will explain now. First, in the 1940s, when Bourguiba visited Turkey, he said, first, it has a lot of impact on Tunisian elite. The case of Turkey, etc., Ataturk, and how he changed the woman. And he influenced principally Bourguiba, and how Bourguiba was really an intellectual man who was influenced by what's happening inside in Tunisia, by his own mother and family, and by the case of Turkey. But he said something. We can do the same with one less of damage. Mm-hmm. And this is, we have to think. And it's really important to think about later, because from time to time Bourguiba will have some, he will hesitate a little in front of critical situations, as planning familial, for example, when we were it was a large program, etc. That, you know, in Tunisia, actually, we don't have the possibility to reproduce the populations. It's a result of the political campaign on planning familial. Bourguiba, sometimes he hesitated. He said, we must probably stop a little bit, etc. But the elite was there behind. No, we have to continue, Donc, Bourguiba has this little bit regard, not looking, he was really very, the case of Turkey was very important, but he was critical too. Now he was influenced by the Turkey. The influence was not only Turkey. Many elite were influenced by what's happening in Syria, in Jordan, in Iran, in Egypt, principally. And in the beginning of the 20th century, many elites asked to bring teachers, women teachers from Syria and from Egypt, for example, to teach women. Donc, the elite was really influenced by what's happening in Europe and in the Arab world. But what I would like to discuss, which is really very important, is how today we don't look enough and we don't have enough research on this. It's how the jurists, how the women who are judges, and we have around 30% of women in Tunisia who are judges, and how they create the law, how they discuss the law, how they think about it, etc. This will be really interesting to do it. And teachers at all different levels, we need to study this, and we don't have anything about. Why I am saying this? For example, at the Zaytuna, the theological university, in the Zaytuna, I had some discussion with students, and not only, and with some colleagues, because I am a member of a commission, they don't teach at the Zaytuna University, for example. It shows us the distance between the state, the role of the state, etc., and what's happening in civil society. And for example, at the University of the Zaytuna, they don't teach the case of women. They don't discuss the case of women. Even in the frame of Islamic law, they don't teach the women who had a part in this debate. And for example, I had to read a case of one of my colleagues, a woman at this university. She was really very badly judged by her men colleagues, which will be very much more traditionalist, keeping, protecting the legal text, the traditional text, etc., from all what kind of new interpretation as those promoted by feminist women and women as Amina, Wadud, etc., etc. Donc we have to continue to work. I think I will finish. I will finish. I think really we need much more work on what's happening at different level, women entrepreneur, jurist, and so on, and to work together. I think this is really very important to bring ties between scholars and women who are on the different field. I think if I express myself correctly. But, yeah.
Okay, I think that we have finished this. Kesha is not, she's going to leave it to later. So thank you so much.